everyone. My name is Sanders Kleinfeld, and it's my pleasure to welcome Erika Nesvold to Talks at Google to discuss her new book, Off Earth, Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. If you're joining us on the live stream today, we'll be doing audience Q&A at the end of the talk, so please drop any questions you have in the chat on the right. In her book, Off Earth, Erika Nesvold explores the ethical and sociocultural implications of building new human settlements in space, raising thought-provoking questions, both philosophical and pragmatic, from should we settle space and who owns space, to what happens if someone steals my stuff in space, and what if I want to have children in space. Erika Nesvold is an astrophysicist who has worked as a researcher at NASA Goddard and the Carnegie Institute for Science. She's the developer for Universe Sandbox, a series of educational space simulator games, a co-founder of the nonprofit organization, the JustSpace Alliance, and the creator and host of the podcast, Making New Worlds. Thanks so much for joining us, Erika.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you so much. So please take it away.
All right. I think my slides will come up. Yep, there they are. So thank you all for joining us today. It's so great to be here to talk about this work. As Sandra said, I'm Erika Nesvold, and I'm an astrophysicist. Although these days I actually work in the video game industry as an astrophysics engineer for Universe Sandbox, which is this beautiful astrophysics simulator that you should all go check out on Steam. But for the past several years, I've also been getting deep into the world of space ethics, and in particular, the ethics of space settlement. So I'm just going to start off today by telling you how exactly that happened. I got my PhD in physics in 2015. I got to wear the fancy hat. Most of my research involved writing computer simulations of other planetary systems to try to find exoplanets. But then while I was working as a postdoc, I had the opportunity to go out to Mountain View, California for a few weeks as part of the first NASA Frontier Development Lab, which is a research program that year was focused on defending the planet from asteroids. So it was very exciting. And as part of this program, I was introduced to several people in the rapidly growing private space industry. This was in 2016, so space mining was all the rage in particular. And a lot of people and to this day consider this growing space economy as a step towards human space settlement, which is something I've always been very interested in, both as an astrophysicist and a fan of science fiction. But when I was out in Silicon Valley, as I talked to these people, I ended up feeling disappointed at some of their answers to my questions about things like how you protect the surface of the moon from potential contamination with your mining equipment. How would you handle labor relations if part of your workforce is in space? And I kept getting a lot of answers along the lines of, oh, we'll worry about that later, which did not seem right to me because it sounded like it was setting up for a lot of future problems in space. But I also recognized that with my physics PhD, I also didn't have the expertise that you need to answer these kind of questions. So when I got back home from the program, I decided to explore these ideas further, and I ended up making a podcast called Making New Worlds. It's available for free online if you want to listen to it. I made 13 episodes where I talked to people who do have the expertise necessary to talk about some of these subjects. So that included historians, space lawyers, philosophers, sociologists, and activists about the different problems that I thought we might run into as we try to expand human civilization into space. Things like environmental protection and labor rights, and also things like criminal justice and reproductive rights. Since making the podcast, that was 2017, 2018, I've expanded it and updated it in the form of a book that came out 2 months ago, almost exactly, called Off Earth, Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. I also had the opportunity to co-edit an anthology called Reclaiming Space, Progressive and Multicultural Visions of Space Exploration, which came out the same month, that has a lot of different contributors. And thanks to all of these conversations I have been having with other people thinking about these topics, I co-founded a nonprofit in 2018 called the JustSpace Alliance, whose mission is to advocate for a more inclusive and ethical future in space, and to also harness people's excitement for space to help them work on building a more just and equitable world today here on Earth. And so that's my little example of how podcasts could be a gateway drug for space ethics. So that's me and how I got to this area of study. But let's talk about the actual subject itself. What does space settlement have to do with ethics? Why should people who are interested in or even advocating for settling space need to think about ethics? A lot of people like to talk about space as a blank slate where we can build these fancy futuristic utopias from scratch because we're starting over fresh. But it's only going to be a blank slate until humans show up, because we're going to bring all of our problems with us. And that includes all of our biases, the different ways that we structure our societies, what we do to our environments. And we're at a key point in time right now today, because people are starting to make serious plans for building habitable outposts in space. Not yet full on settlements, but how would we live permanently in space? These are things people are starting to really think about. But so far, at the moment, space beyond low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station is still only inhabited by a handful of robots. So we're on the verge of having to deal with all these problems and answer some of these questions. So we're still developing our legal approach to space, our policy around space regulation, and we're also still in the middle of deciding what cultural values we want to prioritize as we go into space. So a lot depends on the decisions that we're going to make in the coming years and decades that will propagate on for future generations. So if we want to have a permanent presence in space where our descendants in the future can really thrive instead of just end up in space dystopias, we need to really think deliberately about how we will live with each other and with the space environment. So today, since I only have about 20 minutes, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to 3 big examples of these questions from my book. So let's start with thinking about space as an environment that needs protection. So there's a growing argument that we need to really consider space as an extension of Earth's environment, which we're all already pretty concerned about and worried about how to protect. This is probably the most urgent of the 3 space ethics problems that I'll talk about today, because we're already causing damage to the space environment today, in particular to low Earth orbit. So since Sputnik was launched in 1957, we've been filling up the space around our planet with satellite technology. So here's a screenshot from an excellent online resource called Astrograph, which will give you a real-time look at all of the known spacecraft in orbit around the Earth. I took this last week, April 29th. Over 15,000 satellites have been launched into orbit since 1957, and over 10,000 of those are still in orbit today. But only about 3/4 of them are still functioning. The rest have either they broke down early, or they were never functional, or they were just left up there at the end of their mission because it's cheaper than sending up the fuel you need to deorbit them to burn up in Earth's atmosphere. And by the way, these numbers that I just said, I had to look them up last week again because they've grown so rapidly in the couple of years since I looked them up the first time for my book. This is mostly due to satellite mega constellations like SpaceX's Starlink. In fact, you can see several lines of yellow dots on this screenshot. Those are Starlink satellites. So there's just been a huge boom in the amount of technology we have up in Earth orbit. Here's another view, a little zoomed out. And I'll point out that these are just the large objects that we know about and can track. The European Space Agency estimates that there are probably 1 million smaller pieces of debris around a centimeter in size, and over 130 million around a millimeter in size. And that includes things like fragments from satellite collisions or explosions, drops of leaked coolant, even paint flecks. And even these small pieces of debris are really dangerous to the other technology and people that are up in low Earth orbit, because they're extremely difficult to track, and they're moving around at like 15 kilometers per second, which is about 10 times the speed of a bullet. So if they hit you or your spacecraft, you're not going to have a good time. The more technology we put into this environment, the more debris we risk generating. So, and then that risks more collisions between spacecraft, which produces more debris. And if we're not careful, the concern is that we'll end up filling up these useful orbits with so much debris that we can't use the satellite technologies that we've come to depend on anymore. And that includes things like communication, the Earth science that lets us study climate change from satellites, GPS. So this is really just the tragedy of the commons, because launching a satellite can cause harm to this environment, but it can also make money. So this can lead to a sort of race for companies to try to squeeze out as much profit as they can from low Earth orbit, while as a group, jointly, they're causing immense damage to this environment. And I've also heard this issue referred to as our first big test in space ethics and regulation, because if we can't figure out how to handle this problem as a species, we're going to essentially cut ourselves off from the rest of space, because it will be dangerous to launch spacecraft through this debris-filled environment. And so we need to figure this out, or we won't even get to the point where we're facing the other challenges we'll face in space. Fortunately, it's not just regulators and researchers who are concerned about this problem. Satellite companies themselves are focused on it. We've all seen what the tragedy of the commons can lead to down here on Earth. We can learn from history. And in fact, there are several orbital debris mitigation companies that have started trying to develop technologies to clean up the space debris that already exists. This is a CGI photo of ClearSpace One, which is a proposed mission by a Swiss startup that's partnered with the European Space Agency. They want to demonstrate that they can grab onto a decommissioned satellite and then deorbit with it so that they both burn up in the atmosphere. And that's actually set to launch in 2026. And this is ED-Orbit, which was a similar mission, lost out to ClearSpace, but it would have used either mechanical tentacles or a net like it's shown in this image to grab a piece of debris and then deorbit. But you need more than these technical solutions to deal with this problem. You also need things like regulation, economic incentives, who's going to pay these companies to deorbit their debris. And just generally, you need a change in culture, not just among satellite companies, but among the rest of us, an increase in public awareness, a concern for space as an environment, so that we can support the regulation or whatever economic structure we need to make sure we're protecting this space. And this last one is a challenge, because most people, when they think about protecting the environment, they're picturing pandas and rainforests and coral reefs, whereas this is not just space, so it's not green and Earth-like, but it's literally empty space. There's nothing there, so it's hard to think of it as an environment that's precious that needs to be protected. So getting the public to care is tough, but it's really important. And since no one has been interested in my Put Pandas into Orbit proposal to solve this problem, a lot of public awareness work is being done by people like national space agencies like the ESA and NASA, these space debris mitigation companies, and space researchers who study this problem have been talking a lot about these issues. And I'll point out real quick that low Earth orbit is just one case study in space environmental protection and justice. Eventually, farther in the future, we'll have mining companies on the moon, and we'll be having a whole new set of conversations about things like land use and wilderness protection and all sorts of things. So here's a NASA image that shows the distribution of water ice on the south and north pole of the moon. That's what the blue is showing. That's going to be really handy for people who want to live on the moon. You can also process the water to make fuel. But notice how localized these blue areas are, which is just a reminder that while space might be infinite, the accessible, valuable resources in space that we want to get to and use are limited, and they're usually concentrated into really specific locations. So that's going to lead to questions like, do we need to think about preserving some of these resources for future generations? Is this going to be some kind of first come, first serve gold rush that makes a few people a lot of money? Or do we need to make sure the benefits of these resources are spread out to everyone? And we can also ask broader questions like, will something of value be lost when we start getting in there with mining equipment and damaging this pristine ancient environment that is so far untouched except by a few astronauts and robots? So that was example one. Now let's go from concerns about how to protect the space environment from us to a more human problem. How do we protect individuals from being harmed by society in space? So for example, what happens if someone is living and working in space, maybe on Mars, but then they lose their job? It would be really expensive, prohibitively expensive, to ship them back home to Earth, but now they're just up there in the space habitat. They can't afford to pay for rent, food, water, even air, depending on what you have to buy to survive there. And the problem is, compared to Earth, there's no bridge to live under in space. We're used to poverty on Earth looking something like this, where people have to try to survive off of whatever resources they can scrounge from their environment. So that can cause problems like they find water, but the water is dirty or contaminated. They end up going through trash to find the building materials they need, and they're scrounging for food or growing food however they can. But on Mars, if you get evicted from your habitat dome because you can't pay the rent, you're left with this. You can't even breathe there. There's no water. You can't just go live off the land. So there's a very short amount of time where you can survive without the support of a society. So we're going to end up with an even starker choice than we have here on Earth between just extremely harsh life or death capitalism or figuring out how to build a stronger social welfare network. And as you've all seen on Earth, that kind of debate can lead to a lot of conflict down here, but it's going to be a more urgent problem in space. And that also means that workers in space might be especially vulnerable to exploitation, especially if there's this looming threat of deadly poverty if you get fired. Also, in a space settlement, it's the way that our models have been so far, the plans that people have been making, it's likely that everything a worker would need to live, food, water recycling, air processing, heat, is going to be highly centralized and possibly controlled by whoever built the settlement, which may very well be the company that employs everyone who lives there. So we've seen very similar scenarios to that here on Earth. Here's an example. This is a Pullman railroad car, which was built in the 19th century in the US by the Pullman Palace Car Company. And they built a notorious company town in Pullman, Illinois, where the residents were Pullman employees who paid rent to the company, bought food from the company store. And this led to a big problem when in 1893, the Pullman company reduced wages, but they didn't reduce their rent to compensate. So this led to a massive strike the next year because nobody could afford to pay their rent anymore, and there weren't any alternatives. This is a photo of the Pullman factory, and it's surrounded by security guards and strikers. And so we can learn from historical examples like this as we think about how an isolated space settlement built by a private company would function. And we can ask things like, how much power will the workers have? How much choice will the workers and the residents have if they want to shop around, or are they going to be completely at the mercy of a company that could end up with just repeating these issues and conflicts from the past? And speaking of strikes, protesting in space will also be challenging if the government or the company that you're protesting against is also the group that's in charge of the very air that you're trying to breathe. So here's another example from history. The construction of the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad, which is often pointed to when people are talking about building infrastructure in space. It depended really heavily on Chinese immigrant laborers. They performed this backbreaking, dangerous manual labor, incredibly harsh weather conditions, especially when they were working their way through the mountain ranges. And in 1867, a group of these Chinese railroad workers organized a strike to demand that they be paid the same as their white counterparts, because of course they were being underpaid. So the railroad company cut off their food supply lines, which eventually broke the strike. It didn't even take that long because the strikers were basically in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. They had no way to support themselves once the company cut off their supply lines. The company did eventually raise wages, but of course the dangerous working conditions continued until the railroad was finished. But we can look at this and realize that in space, a company that controls the life support in a habitat wouldn't even need to just cut off the food supply for a strike like this and would have to wait until the strikers got hungry. They could just turn down the air a bit. So aside from things like promoting strong regulation for labor protections or unions for space workers, several researchers who are worried about this have also proposed that we try to design freedom into the habitats themselves to make sure that these options for protest and dissent still exist. So that would be things like making sure that the oxygen control is distributed. So it's not just one person or one company that controls that, or guaranteeing freedom of movement so that if you did decide that you wanted to quit your job and move, there would be an easier and cheaper way to do that, either between habitats or even back to Earth. So these options might all be more expensive, but they'll guarantee that there's more protection for workers and other people who want to protest in these space settlements. And for my last example, we've been talking about how workers in space, how to protect them from their employers, or how to protect the population from a government if they want to protest. So now I want to move into my third example, where I'll ask, how do we protect individuals in a space settlement from being harmed by each other? Most of the legal structure that's focused on minimizing conflict in space, international treaties and such, are all about preventing war. So the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is the big international space treaty, it forbids nations from appropriating territory in space. It includes a ban on nuclear weapons in space. But what it doesn't talk about explicitly is interpersonal harm. So what if someone commits a crime in space to one of the other residents? There are a lot of parallels between space and Antarctica, because Antarctica is such a harsh and isolated environment, although still nicer to live in than space is. But it's also scientifically fascinating, so people want to live and work there. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples from recent Antarctic history that parallel this problem really well. So to start with, one question you could ask is, whose laws apply in a place like Antarctica or space? What does crime mean? Who do we have to give us those laws? In Antarctica, according to the 1959 Antarctic Treaty, if you're accused of a crime, you're subject to punishment by whatever country you're a citizen of. So, for example, in 1996, 3 US American FBI agents went down to the American McMurdo base, which I've highlighted here in Antarctica, to investigate reports of an assault. One worker down there assaulted another one with a hammer, and since they were Americans and on an American base, it was the American FBI agents who came down to investigate. And similarly, according to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, the activities of individuals in space require the authorization and continuing supervision of their country. And so they would be subject to the laws of the US if they came from the US. But this doesn't address the practical problem of what you would do with someone who was charged with a crime in space. For example, are you going to send FBI agents up to Mars? Probably not. Do you ship those people home for trial? This is what happened in Antarctica when one researcher actually stabbed another one at the Russian Bellinghausen station in Antarctica in 2018. So the assailant turned himself in. He was detained in a church in Antarctica for 11 days before he was flown back to St. Petersburg in Russia and charged with attempted murder. Eventually the charges were dropped. But that would be a lot more difficult on the moon or Mars, which, again, a lot farther away. It's very unlikely we would send someone all the way back to Earth for trial. So what does that mean? Are they going to be tried and convicted by their fellow space residents? That could lead to some potential problems if you're in a really small community, if there's conflict of interest. What if the accused is really important to the community in some way, like they're the only pilot or the chief life support engineer? And we have to work all of these things out, ideally before a crime is committed. And then the big question that I'm most interested in is, what if that person is found guilty? Again, are you going to send them home to serve out a sentence at again, great cost? You could just kick them out of the habitat. But once again, this is what's outside the habitat. That's essentially just a death sentence. And what I've discovered as I've written and talked about this subject before is that what I call airlock justice is extremely popular in science fiction. Here's the TV Tropes article about it. People love the idea of, oh, someone gets convicted of a crime, kick them out the airlock. That makes for great fiction, but I don't think that any of us want to live in a society where every crime is punishable by the death penalty. So what do we do? What do we do instead? We could build prisons in space. That's mostly how we handle crime here on Earth. But regardless of how you feel about the effectiveness of imprisonment as a response to crime on Earth, it's actually extremely impractical in space. So picture it, this is the first crime committed on Mars. First, you would need the resources to build and maintain the prison, which likely you're already living in a really scarce resource environment. So you need a pressurized and shielded habitat, you need air, water, heat. You probably need the labor to build the prison itself. And historically, there are examples where this last problem has been solved by forcing the convicted residents to build their own prison themselves. One example is Pitcairn Island, which is way out in the middle of the South Pacific. It's the little red dots on the lower left of this image. It was actually populated by the descendants of mutineers from the HMS Bounty. But then in the 90s, there were widespread accusations of sexual assault, and the defendants in the various court cases constructed a prison while they were awaiting trial, which some of them later ended up serving in. You're also going to need guards for your prison, and now you've lost the labor contributions from the prisoners and the guards from all the rest of the work that needs to get done in the settlement. So just really impractical. I'll point out that an astrobiologist named Charles Cockle, who writes a lot about liberty and design and space settlements. He's even designed what he calls a humane but effective space prison that addresses some of these issues, including the labor needed from guards. He calls this ExoConFac, the Extraterrestrial Containment Facility. But when I read about this, I said, what if we take a step back and actually ask, is this the best approach to criminal justice in space? Are we just trying to push back against all these practical problems, or are there alternate approaches to criminal justice in a space settlement? So what can we learn from societies on Earth, either historically or today, that just didn't have prison systems, but managed to figure out how to address interpersonal harm in various ways? Or what can we learn from the prison abolition movement, who are today fighting for alternatives to prisons, including things like restorative justice, which is an approach that reorients a justice system towards prioritizing assisting the victims with healing, restoring safety in the community, and avoids the whole problems of the carceral system by doing that. Now, this is a topic that gets a lot of people very emotional because people have strong feelings about criminal justice. But that if you're feeling strong feelings, I think that the point here is that this is something we should all talk about and figure out before we end up in a situation where we have someone accused of a crime in space. And I'll point out that we don't have prisons in space right now. So now is the time to figure out how we would want to address this kind of interpersonal harm before we get up there and end up just having to put together a last minute solution that might not end up representing our values. So that was a quick little tour of just a little taste of the challenges that we'll face as we try to expand our civilization into space. And these are all based on what we've already seen as issues throughout history and today here on Earth. There's plenty of other ones that you can read about in my book or listen to on the podcast, and that includes things like property use. There's legal systems and treaties and such that tell us who owns or doesn't own land and space, but we're still going to end up in scenarios where two different groups want to use the same piece of space land for two different purposes, and we'll have to figure out how to address that in a healthy way. Planetary protection, how do we protect space from being contaminated by Earth life? What do we do about the potential for war, whether that's conflicts between communities that are living in space or between settlements in space and back on Earth? Way in the future, once we start having children in space, if that's even possible, we'll need to think about reproductive rights. How do we keep a population from getting too overpopulated or too underpopulated without violating the bodily autonomy of the residents? So in all of these questions, one really important step to having these conversations is to include not just engineers and entrepreneurs in our plans, but social scientists and other areas of expertise who maybe haven't thought about their work in the context of space, but have a lot that they could give us so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel and repeat a lot of mistakes. So that includes people like historians, especially colonial history, law and policy, a lot of fantastic people working in space law and policy and regulation right now. Of course, ethics and philosophy. Philosophers have a lot of big picture expertise to share. Sociologists and anthropologists can teach us about how humans have lived together in small groups and harsh environments in the past and what works well and what doesn't. And I would say even people who are activists, social justice activists, because they usually, whether you agree with their particular proposals or not, they have a lot of expertise in recognizing problems in a community and proposing alternative solutions instead of just saying, oh, here's the problems we're going to have in space. They have suggestions for better ways that we could try to live better together. And lastly, I'll just say one really key question to ask is, why do we want to settle space in the first place? There's a lot of different answers to this question, and those answers will determine the choices that we make, the answers to all of the rest of these questions. We can also ask things like, how should the benefits of space be distributed amongst the human species? Not just the people who end up living in space, but also the ones back here on Earth. And I'll also say it's crucial to think about what kinds of values you would want to see in your descendants' cultures in space, and look around and see if you're prioritizing those values in the companies and organizations that you work in today, because that's how we'll perpetuate things throughout time, is by representing those values as we work towards space today. Even if space settlement doesn't happen in our lifetime, thinking about these issues in space can help us learn more about all of these issues that we face on Earth today, as well as historically. And it can also help us come up with more creative, radical solutions to these problems than that we otherwise maybe wouldn't be able to consider if we're stuck in a terrestrial mindset and just looking at our societies here on Earth. So I'll just wrap up there, and Sanders, maybe we'll have a chat and answer some questions.
Yes, thank you so much for the excellent overview of all the challenges that we face, Erica. And for our folks in the audience, we'll be taking audience Q&A questions in just a little bit. So if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We'd love to hear from you as well. So my main takeaway after reading your book was that basically all of the challenges that we have on Earth, we're also going to have in space, but in a context of limited oxygen, water, and gravity. This feels really, really daunting to even consider the prospect of building a long-term settlement in space.
Yeah, that's often the first sort of emotional roller coaster people go through when they start thinking about these issues, whether the practical issues or the ethical issues. Is daunting. It's very much the right word. Um, and that's why I say it's very possible that we're not going to have permanent human settlements in space within our lifetimes. But I don't think that's a reason to not try to think about how we would do that. And that includes the technical side, the work that people do to try to figure out how would we recycle water, how would we extract resources and build buildings and habitats out of these resources available in space. That's all really interesting stuff, and also potentially really helpful here on Earth. And I think it's the same way with these social questions. If we think about how would we protect labor rights in a space settlement, even if none of us or our children even are having to deal with those questions in space, it can help us figure out better solutions here on Earth.
Yeah, what really struck me is so many of the ethical and social challenges that we would be experiencing in space are really tied to this idea of scarcity and how we will deal with allocating finite resources in all those circumstances that you talked about, where there's limited oxygen, for example. You talk also in the book quite a bit about how would we potentially ration medical care in a situation where we don't have enough medical facilities. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how things might work in that sphere as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's funny because a lot of people who advocate for space settlement, or people trying to get investments in their private space company, they try to present space as this infinite resource. And in the very long term, on the big scale, perhaps it is, but on the short term, certainly for the first several generations of people living there, things are going to be so scarce, more scarce than we've ever experienced here on Earth. And that'll be a huge challenge, not just technologically and in terms of survival, but also in figuring out how to share those scarce resources. And yeah, in the book, I didn't have time to fit it into the talk today, but I have a whole chapter on medical resources and how you triage medical care if you have limited resources, whether that's medication or technology or even just medical expertise, depending on how many doctors, for example, that you've brought with you. I actually started writing that chapter before the pandemic, and then the pandemic gave us all a crash course in those challenges.
Right, right. The lessons we learned with how to deal with it here on the plus side can potentially be extrapolated for different environments in space, although at a much more challenging scale, probably. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, I think also related to that, I think a lot of people have this perception that like space is just this completely blank slate and that makes it easy to just build a new society when the reverse may be true for the finite resources. And also I think a point that you made is is it actually a blank slate? What if we do discover life in space? That adds a whole different additional layer of ethical complexity to things. And
Yeah.
have people considered that very heavily as well?
Yeah, that's still a big open question because we don't have proof that there's life in
Mhm.
space. But it is still an open question when it comes, especially to microbial life in different places in the solar system that specifically we might want to live in, like Mars, like some of the moons in the outer solar system that we think have water on them. Um, that also means that there might be microbial life there that we could recognize. And the big question that people have been debating for decades is what happens if we discover that microbial life? Do we need to protect it? Should we leave Mars to the microbes, which is what Carl Sagan said. He said, if we find microbial life on Mars, we should leave Mars to the Martians. And I think in that scenario, we'll have a big debate about it. And even until then, there's a big debate about how much effort we need to put into making sure we don't bring our Earth microbes along that might kill off these hypothetical Martians or replace them before we can even find them.
Yeah, there's this tension, it feels like, between doing that research and also at the same time doing the settlement. And the two values may be in conflict with each other, and that could potentially be challenging.
Absolutely, and I've noted that astronomers and planetary scientists, among all the different fields of science, haven't had to think a lot about these problems before because we're used to studying things that nobody else wants to put their hands on because they can't put their hands on it. But
Mhm.
now we're getting to the point where scientific interest is going to maybe conflict with private industry or people who want to live in space, and that's going to be tough.
Yeah, and related to that, one thing that you also talk about in the book is in the short term at least, it may be very limited as to how many people have that opportunity to go to space. I think you said, I think just over 500 people have had that opportunity thus far. And how do we decide who gets to go? So it's even more scarce in that very beginning in terms of that.
That's right, and this is a big question we're all struggling with today. Is how do you decide who gets to go to space? So at the moment, and probably for a long time, there are more people who want to go to space than can at the moment. So how do we make that decision? And that'll be a bigger deal when we get to the point where we're sending people into space to potentially live there permanently. How would you pick who your first set of settlers are? And the reasons that you're going to space are kind of going to shape the answer to that, but the decisions you make will really, really affect the future generations of that settlement. So it's important to think about.
Yeah, how are we making those decisions right now as we're sending astronauts into space? I know you mentioned in the book that you actually applied to be an astronaut at one point. I'm curious what
Twice.
that experience twice.
Yeah.
I'm curious what that experience was like.
Well, I haven't made it past the first round, but other people I know have, and
Mhm.
it's pretty well known. I think that the NASA astronaut application process is extremely rigorous because they have so many more people who want to be astronauts than they can accept, and they also have just extremely high standards. But the history of astronaut selection is very different from how private space companies are looking at choosing who they're sending up to be space tourists or researchers in space because NASA was focused on accomplishing these missions. Initially, they just hired a bunch of test pilots because they were testing new technologies. And so tends to be historically a lot of white American men and white Russian men. That's started to become more diverse, but they're also very focused on medical screening. They want very specific types of bodies that can accomplish certain things in space. Private companies don't have the same kind of constraints, but also private companies want to charge for the ticket prices, so
Right.
that's its own kind of filter.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely a lot of challenges either way. So I think we have a few questions from the audience. So I was wondering if we could pop one of those up.
Sounds great.
Uh, Great. A question from Joshua. Did laws at sea and early sea explorers come up in your investigation? Is any of that applicable?
Oh, the laws of the sea are absolutely applicable, and not just early sea explorers, but the international waters, the high seas today, is similarly to Antarctica. It can make a good parallel for space in certain ways, because the middle of the Pacific Ocean isn't covered by any one country's laws. Nobody claims ownership to it, and so you can look at space the same way. And in fact, some people have tried to make arguments for the way we should approach space resources by pointing to the way we look at international waters. One example is that the U.S.'s Space Act of 2015 said, okay, people can't go to the moon, for example, and say, I own this piece of the moon. But we want to encourage a space mining industry here in the US. So we're going to say we're going to treat it like international waters. Nobody owns the moon, nobody owns the ocean, but the resources that you pull out, whether that's whatever you're mining on the moon or the fish that you're fishing out of the ocean, you own that and you can sell it and make a profit. And so people do draw a lot of parallels to the sea.
That's really good to know. Next question. Question from Timea. Thanks for the great talk. You mentioned you're a fan of sci-fi, and many aspects of your talk reminded me of social issues portrayed in the book show The Expanse. Any thoughts on that?
Wait, she went on.
Sorry, continued. Curious if you think there are elements of that story that seem realistic from a political, technological perspective based on how you envision space settlement.
Let me tell you, I had not watched or read The Expanse before I started the podcast. And by the end of the podcast, I realized, man, I really need to go watch The Expanse because every other conversation, someone brought up something. And now I've read and watched the entire series. It's excellent. I highly recommend it. There are definitely some elements of that story that seem realistic from the political perspective in particular. They also try to be very realistic on the technical side, which is great, but they handle a lot of things like labor rights and the fact that there's an oppressed group in that show based on the belters, the people who lived in the asteroid belt and extract resources that are valuable to Earth and Mars, but they are also oppressed and exploited for their labor. And it also explores another question I look at in the book, which is what if people who live in space, because they've grown up in a low gravity environment, they can't survive a trip back to Earth? That's explored in the story, and I think it's a really fascinating question. Is that ethical to do? Are we taking something away from our descendants if we remove their ability to come back to their home planet? And I think that's a fascinating question that the show and the books explore. Great question.
Definitely. Everybody should check out The Expanse next. Next question. Question from Chris. What about the proposed moon zones for mining? How should we be looking at that issue?
So first I'll say I'm not a space lawyer, but I've talked to a lot of space lawyers. The US has a new set of sort of non-binding agreements called the Artemis Accords that are actually pretty short and not too legal-easy. So I recommend everybody go look at them, that several countries have signed on to. And they try to expand on the Outer Space Treaty, which said you have to avoid harmful interference with other people trying to do activities on the moon. And they say, okay, well, how would we actually do that? There's a consultation process required. What would that look like? And the Artemis Accords suggests drawing these safe zones around something like a mining encampment to make sure that everyone understands that equipment in that area might be damaged, or you might not be able to build your telescopes there. And so that's a very early step in that direction of figuring that out. I don't think it answers all of our questions. And I think we're not going to get answers to all of these questions until we actually have a case in space where there's a conflict and we see how all these laws actually play out.
Question from SW. So do you think this will lead to wildly different social contracts between colonies?
Well, I can tell you that a lot of people who have advocated for space settlement going back several decades have been really excited about the idea that this blank slate idea gives us the opportunity to experiment with different ways of building societies, different social contracts. And they've even people like Gerard K. O'Neill, who advocated for building space stations, and people in that era said they'll be like laboratories where we're performing all these different political science experiments and see which ones work and which ones don't. And I think that's an interesting perspective. I mean, it's been true on Earth as well. But the people who go and live in these laboratories will be bringing all of their conceptions of how things should work from Earth. So again, not a total blank slate. And the other thing I'll say is I don't think we should really encourage a laboratory perspective on that, because you got to think about the people in the laboratory experiments that fail. There's got to be some kind of floor that protects people in these societies that don't make it, and we don't just say, oh well, they picked the wrong political system. Oh well. So that's something I think about a lot.
Yeah, we have ethics for laboratory experiments as well. So
that's right. We try not to put humans in them without a lot of consent. So we got to think about that.
Yeah, I think we have time for like one more question. From Alexi. What would be the pros and cons of the space colonization be driven by the enterprise versus driven by the government? If it is government, can we prevent using forced labor such as Australia's penal colonies?
Boy, there's a lot in that two questions. The difference between space settlement driven by profit seekers, so private companies, versus something like national or international governments, you can think of a lot of differences, mostly because they're motivated by different things. By law, here in the U.S., private companies, their legal obligation is to their shareholders, and so if they make a decision based on ethics that means that there's less profit, they can get sued for that. So no matter how ethical the people are within the companies, that structure itself can lead to decisions that are very different than how a government, for example, would make decisions in space. A government has to answer to its voters, but also a government is focused on things like nationalism, trying to get a better militaristic advantage in space, which is something that a lot of governments have looked at before. And so you can think of pros and cons like that for all of them. And of course, that's just two examples of motives of why we might want to go to space. How can we avoid forced labor? That's a great question. That's something I think about a lot, and especially when it relates to criminal justice, because as I mentioned, if you're accusing someone, if you're convicting someone of a crime in space and you decide to put them in space prison or exile them, for example, then you're losing them from the labor pool, and labor is likely to also be really scarce. And one alternative to that is to force them to keep working, but that historically has led to a lot of terrible exploitation here on Earth as well. So all of these things need to be thought about together.
Yes. So unfortunately, we have to end this conversation for now, but encourage everybody to continue having these conversations. I think that's the really important takeaway from this book, that we need to be proactive as we start doing space exploration about what this entails for society. So I wanted to thank you again so much, Erika, for joining us and for leading this fantastic and fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for the great questions.
And be sure to check out Erika's book, Off Earth, available now wherever books are sold. Thank you again.
All right, thank you.